All right, let me have a sip of my hipster coffee here. Someone had, I don't prefer it, but someone finally had some Equal in the office kitchen, and I used it, and I thought, wow, I'm actually not going to die of cancer because of this. And my coffee tastes a little bit sweeter than normal. Gee, what a revelation. All right. There's a lot we could have gone over. In fact, I really debated about what to do today because I watched how Alexander Volkanovski performed against Jose Aldo. And while he didn't score any unbelievable knockdowns, he didn't stop him. It wasn't nearly as impressive in terms of the finish. Well, there was no finish in the Aldo fight, but I mean, there was a finish in the Mendez fight. You could have gone through and broken all that down. But really, what he did was absolutely incredible. Delayed timing on some of his strikes, so many different feints and fakes and setups and follow-throughs. He confused Aldo in a way that no one's really ever confused him. Go back and watch the Frankie Edgar fight. Frankie Edgar had 5 rounds to try and do that, and he couldn't. Volkanovski did it in all 3. So just a really, really impressive guy in Alexander Volkanovski. And we will talk to him a little bit later today. But I decided not to do that for today's show. In fact, I decided to cover something that I thought didn't need to be covered. I thought it was just accepted common understanding about how things work in MMA. But it turns out it's not. And that is the idea of slams. Jessica Andrade becomes the new UFC strawweight champion off of a high crotch lift, picks her up, dumps her, and Rose Namajunas goes sort of like head and neck first. She's out, and Andrade is your new champion. She was getting thoroughly outclassed before that, but this is MMA, and crazy things happen, and there you go. I didn't even realize there was a controversy. I didn't think twice about it, and then I saw the response afterwards, and I was really kind of surprised that people were against it. I don't know this to be true. It's just a hunch of mine. But I basically believe that if you came up in MMA during the 90s or the 2000s, there was nothing controversial about her throw. That's not probably true for everybody. That's probably generally true. I think there's a newer generation of fans that I don't agree with their assessment, but they're trying to take risk-taking a little bit more seriously. I think it's misguided, but I understand that it's a good faith approach. Here's what I would like to do today. Donks, countrymen, Romans, lend me your ear. I know a lot of times I get up here and I rant and I rave and I make a point that to me seems obvious, and I might not do it in a way that curries a lot of support. What I want to do today is not that. What I want to do today is speak to 2 different audiences. Number 1, your slam skeptics, people who were really against what happened, both as a means of ending a fight and as allowing that kind of thing to happen to begin with. And also, I want to speak to people who are pro-slam. And the reason why is because it's not enough to say, I have no problem with it. You have to know why it's okay. Justify for me the use of slams in MMA. Tell me why it's okay. Don't tell me that it's allowed and then therefore I just accept it. Give me the reason, the underpinning, the ideas that make that acceptable. I intend to do that today. All right? So let's go to the first slide. Here we are. Why slamming out of subs is pure MMA. I'm going to start with my broadest claim, and then I'm going to go through and I think prove it for you. Slamming out of submissions in MMA is not merely fair and acceptable, it is essential to having a coherent rule set. To eliminate slamming out of subs in MMA would be to take away what makes MMA at its core what it actually is. That is what I want you to think about as I progress through these arguments. Now, there could be many more arguments. Standard disclaimer, I don't present this to you to be the best or only or most complete analysis. It's just mine. I always encourage you to hear what others have to say. I know my former colleague, Mark Ramundi, spoke to a lot of regulators to see what they had to say. I think that's important, but I don't think that's the entire story. Much like what hopefully I'm going to present to you, you might find important, but it's also not the end of the story. Getting a wider perspective. But here's the thing. I don't want regulators just being the only ones who participate in this conversation. You and I should as well. And we should know why we allow certain things and don't allow certain things. All right? So let's start with the most obvious one. if we can, I'm going to pull up some additional notes that I have here because I'm very well prepared, as you can see. I always come the most prepared. All right, here it is, drafts. Okay. Number one, there are limits placed on slams already. Look at the title that I have here. Why slamming out of subs is pure MMA. The first point to note is that slams are forbidden, but for one circumstance, when the person doing the slamming is having a submission applied to them. In fact, we know that because there's a rule that says this. I'll read it to you for folks who can't see it. A pile driver, or the rule is spiking an opponent to the canvas onto the head or neck is forbidden. A pile driver is considered to be any throw where you control your opponent's body, placing his feet towards the sky and his head straight down, and then forcibly drive your opponent's head into the canvas and flooring material. It should be noted, when a fighter is placed into a submission hold by their opponent, if that fighter is capable of elevating their opponent, they may bring that opponent down in any fashion they desire because they are not in control of their opponent's body. The fighter who is attempting the submission can either adjust their position or let go of their hold before being slammed to the canvas. So number one, we don't even allow for all kinds of slams. We allow for slams essentially under one circumstance. That circumstance is when someone is applying a submission to you, whether that's a triangle, whether that is the setup of a Kimura or something like that. Now there's a debate about how much of, it's kind of funny. If Rose had never gone for the armbar in the first round off the Kimura grip, would we have called what she was doing a submission? Like, if you just took what happened in the second round, just the throw itself and the slam, where was the submission? There was none, which is kind of interesting. But we thought that there might be as like the first setup towards one because of what had happened in the first round. But in any case, so we've already narrowed the scope to a tiny little amount. And I want to dig into what that means here for just a second, because I think it's really important. First of all, we already eliminated it by virtue of the rule set, number one. Number two, even if you don't have a slam, people are like, oh, well, it could be super dangerous. It can be. There are health risks associated with it. But even if you don't, there are all kinds of perfectly legal throws, takedowns, and other forms of acceptable up and down motion on a fighter that would not technically be described as a slam that can cause all kinds of damage. I'm not trying to say that that makes it okay. I'm simply pointing out we've regulated out the worst kind, but for one circumstance. We often allow for many other kinds, and I don't hear a lot of belly aching about it. You could say, well, this kind offers the most kind of catastrophic injury, but even that's not necessarily true. Igor Zinoviev had his collarbone broken by Frank Shamrock and ended his whole career off of a slam. Had really very little to do, some to do with head trauma, but that wasn't or even neck trauma. That wasn't the defining aspect of it. So just to be clear, it's also a little bit incoherent. It's going to be hard to define what you can and can't allow. Making a rule that limits the worst kind is more than justifiable, but understand there's a ton of exception here. There's a ton of nuance. Saying, well, this is the worst kind, we should do something about it, sure, but just understand there's going to be holes in that intellectual boat taking on water this entire time. Trying to regulate out this problem is a noble exercise, but it's one that's going to be fraught with limitations no matter what. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, remember, one reason why we put limits on them is one by rule set, but there's also a natural limit on slams. There's a tax to be paid. They are, even if it's legal, right, a full slam onto the back, they take a lot of energy. They take a lot of energy, and if you don't actually crash with the opponent and then control them on the ground, it's actually no good, right? So, one, we've regulated out the worst kind. Two, even the kinds we do allow for aren't all that valuable if you can't necessarily follow up and crash with them. I'm trying to get you to think about ways in which this problem can be both expansive and also limited, but also, I guess what I'm trying to argue is, in the second point here, by examining some of the rule sets here, sorry, I'm lost on my notes, it's not a thing that happens all the time. It's actually quite rare. People don't want to do it because it can be very, very hard on their own body to score something that might have a very iffy effect. It's not something that happens with routine regularity. And I guess sort of the last thing about the first point that I wanted to notice, and I'll get off these notes, it's essentially impossible to too tightly regulate. I'm going to show you a bunch of throws that are perfectly legal, and a bunch of slams on the head that are perfectly legal that look almost identical. But you would say, well, wait, the slamming should only happen when there's a submission. Things happen that look very, very similar in the flow of combat, and we have no problem allowing for it. So my point being is, if you wanted to really, truly eliminate all kinds of slams that you would deem dangerous, you'd be taking away key portions of what makes MMA MMA. I don't think anybody wants to do that, right? You'll see that a little bit later. All right. So they're effective without being overly dangerous in low doses. Here's what I mean on this one. I was asking people, like, where are the bodies? It's not to say that a slam on the head in the case of a submission is not dangerous. Of course it is dangerous. It is super dangerous, or at least there are obvious health risks associated. But here's the thing. You can't really name a whole lot of people who have suffered a slam onto the head and neck from when they were attempting a submission who have had real lasting consequences. I'm sure there are some, but people are treating it like it's this imminent danger. Like, if it's not this one that happens, it's the next one that's going to happen. And if people have, okay, so let me just stick there. There's not a ton of evidence to suggest that's necessarily happening or really true. In fact, some doctors have noted even at just any kind of an angle, if there's any kind of flexion in the neck, if it's not straight down, that can cause problems, but not the kind of catastrophic injury that we typically associate with. And I had sort of pointed out in American football, at the Pee Wee level, high school, college, pro, people are getting paralyzed every year, and it's all well documented. And folks have said, well, that's different. It's different because those collisions happen all the time in American football. Of course there's more injury. But that's the point. The point is, we've already put a ton of limits on them. They're hard to execute. There's a physical tax on it. There are other kind of throws that can get you pretty close that are perfectly legal. And we don't allow it except for the case of a submission. So the entire point is that they might carry some real health risks, but they happen so infrequently that freaking out about it and saying we need to change the rules is not a justifiable or rational position. That's the whole point. Also, consider something else about, like, what we tolerate and what we don't. Think about everything that happened in the UFC in 2018, in one calendar year. Now think about all the damage that happened by virtue of a punch. Imagine we tallied everything up, every concussion, every broken tooth, every broken jaw, orbital bone, cut, laceration, whatever a punch did, CTE even, and think about all the damage think about all the damage that happens in the course of one calendar year. And imagine we made a bar chart to show exactly how much it was. Now we take slams in the case of a submission right next to it. What do you think is going to be higher? And I know what the obvious response is, which is, well, the slam carries a higher probability of catastrophic injury. One, I'm not sure that's true. Two, even if it is true, it's so infrequent that we tolerate this, literally this mass abuse of humanity by virtue of a punch, by virtue of a kick, by virtue of a knee, that it ends up being so much worse in the end than this. In the end, the question is, when you're measuring health outcomes from fighters and you're trying to work backwards and figure out where all the abuse came from, how much comes from this in a calendar year, year over year? Virtually none. Virtually none. Crying about it after one case, I don't know where I see the cause for alarm. If you're really concerned about damage to fighters, what are the biggest contributors? Each punch is potentially low risk, but in total, look at the abuse it does. And in the end, you just kind of have to accept this is what fighting is about. This is what fighting is about. Fighting is about the destruction of the human corporeal body. That is what you are set out to do. Now you might say, well, why don't we allow eye gouging and we don't pulling of the ears or fish hooking? Part of it is to sell palatability to the public. Part of it is gouging out the eyes would be so catastrophic and so easy. There would be no going back, right? You can imagine someone taking the back and then just digging out the eye. This would be so abusive, so easy, so readily doable. You would end everyone's career and shorten it very quickly. None of that happens with this. None of that happens with this inside MMA. Doesn't mean there's not a health risk, just means we have to properly assess the risk based on its incident rate inside the sport. And then we have to have a frank discussion about what kinds of punishments we allow vis-a-vis other forms of attack that in totality are much worse. In fact, we covet the more worse kind in the end. Lastly, and this might be the most important consideration here, it's the intellectual underpinning of these two. Here I'm trying to show you there's already natural limits. Hard to do, and it's outlawed in most cases. In this case, because of that, it's so low, doesn't turn out to be the health risk that alarmist says it is, but this is the most important one. And we're going to look at some tape here. They are essentially, the slams out of subs, they are essential to maintaining a coherent rule set and fair competition. Several years ago, I did, if you can put the slide up, the thumbnail. Several years ago, I did an interview in an old series I used to do, if you're an MMA fighting old head, called Technique Talk. And I spoke to Chael Sonnen. He made a point inside this interview that has resonated with me since then. And his point is, if you really think about what MMA is, now not in totality because you don't allow eye gouging or hair pulling or things like that, but in totality, at its core, MMA is about taking things that are illegal in jiu-jitsu and making them legal. Things that are illegal in boxing and making it legal. You can't slam in jiu-jitsu, you can slam inside MMA again under the sub condition. You can't take someone down in boxing, you can take them down in MMA, right? And to take your pick. You can't kick someone in boxing, you can kick them inside MMA. You can't clinch in glory, you can clinch in MMA, right? It's taking everything that's illegal and then making it legal. Put the slide up here. This is the quote from Chael Sonnen, and I'll tweet this out at LThomasNews. If you can't read it, I'll read it to you very quickly. Here's what you do in any combat sport. You want to find out what's illegal, and whatever is illegal, whatever is illegal is what you want to do in MMA. A perfect example would be dirty boxing. The reason you can't grab a guy around the collar and his neck and start punching with your free hand match in boxing is because it's so effective that they had to make it illegal. Wrestling is the same way with a lot of our locks. There's times in wrestling where we're not allowed to lock our hands together. The reason is if we locked our hands, the other guy would never get away, and it would just be a battle of who could ever get to that lock first. So you want to find out what is illegal, and you quickly want to start implementing them if they are legal in a sanctioned MMA fight, because that is what is most effective. If you watch a jiu-jitsu match and someone applies what Rose has, they have to find a lot of different solutions. Part of what MMA is to say, right, but what if we stopped putting that limit on you? What if we didn't make that a rule? What if we could say you can use brute force to get out of it? That is, at its core, what MMA is about. I tweeted this earlier. You can put the, I'll just do this here. I tweeted this earlier. I cannot imagine making the argument that you self-identify as an MMA fan and being against slams in the case of submission. Doing what she did to get out of this is at its core what the entire exercise is about. It is about the adaptation of the rule set by taking a composite sport, pulling it out and saying, right, now you have to deal with a rule set that is so open, let's see what works here. That's true for boxing, that's true for jiu-jitsu, that's true for amateur wrestling. By the way, some of these slams may or may not be legal in amateur wrestling because the rule is like if it's unnecessary force, and there's certain rules about spiking on a suplex and whatever. But that's what this is. That is what this is about, man. If you made this illegal, it's not clear how much better health outcomes would be. It's not, you'd be taking away a lot of other techniques beyond this one that you would not want to get rid of, which I'm going to show you. And then more importantly, dude, what are we doing? What are we doing when we say that you can't use brute strength to get out of submission? MMA is about using all the tools, your brains, your technique, as well as your goddamn physical strength. I cannot imagine being an MMA fan and yes, having concern for a rule set that may create catastrophic injury. Of course, let's have a discussion about it. But when you really think about what the rule is and why it is that way, you want to leave it as open as possible so that people from composite sports can't hide inside their own old rule set. It's as real as it gets. That is what this is about. All right. Now, with that being said, let's just briefly look at this, and I want to show you something. All right, so what does she do? Here's your Kimura grip over the top, okay? The Kimura grip, you grab someone's own wrist and then you grab your own. By the way, it's never with a bent wrist. You want to rotate your hands over. It really drives the strength into it, man. And if you've never had a Kimura grip put on you in any particular circumstance, either this one or whatever, it is a super powerful grip, man. It's very hard to strip off and break, okay? It's insanely powerful. So she has essentially, Rose, attached herself to Jessica Andrade. And we all know the story. Before she had her head on the inside, this time she has her head on the outside. So you all know what happens. She brings her up like this, right? You can see she gets her head high like this, and then she just tries to turn and dump her. And she comes down on her head and neck. Notice, I'm not saying this is good. Part of fighting is just hurting each other, including very badly. She lands on the side of her head and neck. It's not straight down that the doctors were talking about. So that's number one. Number two, it's to get out of ostensibly a sub. So it's totally okay. She tries to break fall like Fedor did against Randleman, but it doesn't do any good. And then she goes out. So there it is. She is essentially, this is a high crotch lift. The right elbow is super in deep. It's a pickup and it's a turn. Now, what was funny about it was, you guys remember what Daniel Cormier said? Daniel Cormier said, see, here's what happens. I do this throw all the time, but they don't have the Kimura grip, so they go right over. And I was thinking to myself, then that must be true. You know, I remember that? The Strikeforce Heavyweight Grand Prix final, when he did it to Josh Barnett. Here is the exact same throw. He comes in, he punches. Now, this is a single leg. Daniel Cormier does this this is the exact same throw you're going to see. He starts out on a single leg, but as Josh Barnett begins to react to it, he changes to a high crotch. I want you to pay attention here very quickly if we can. So he's going to, let's put the arrow here. He's going to drag him this way, and then as Barnett's energy goes this way, he's going to pick him up and turn him. That's what's going to happen here, right? So you see he's in on the single leg. Now watch what happens here. He's going to turn. Let me zoom out a little bit. Cormier turns. He's like running the pipe. And you see Barnett get ready to set up. Now, maybe he was going for the Kimura, but he doesn't get it in time. And what happens is, this is the right hand of Cormier. Watch it dig deep. Watch it go further. Right now, there is no high crotch lift. This is just a single leg. But watch this. He pulls, and then, you can't see from this angle, now he's elbow deep right here. Right? So just a subtle movement. Pulls, steps in, elbow deep. And now him being elbow deep allows him to lift his hips, and now he goes all the way over. It's the exact same throw, identical, other than for the Kimura grip, which makes all the difference in the end. Here's another look at it, right? Let's take a look at it. So he's going to pull him in this direction and then send him over when he comes over. Ready? So watch, he pulls. Now watch his right elbow go elbow deep right there. You see that? He should have taken a step here, but I'm not going to critique it, a two-time Olympian. And then just picks him up. Hips are lower than the other guys. And watch. Head on the outside, right? Picks him up, turns him. Bang. Now here's the other point about a slam, why slams like this one are perfectly legal are hard to do. Think about how much energy it takes to slam a guy like this. And number two, you have to cover them. So watch him crash to the mat here, because you have to control them once you come down. It's the same thing. Here's another case of a slam that was allowed. This is UFC 111. This is Kurt Pellegrino. I believe this is Fabricio Camois. No, this has nothing to do with anything. I just wanted to show this. When was the last time you saw this inside the UFC? I miss this kind of stuff. Whoop, drop Seo. See that? He didn't quite get it. He didn't quite get him on top, but it's a drop Seonagi. You can do standing Seonagis, which if you've ever been thrown in a standing Seonagi, it hurts a lot. But he does a drop Seonagi, which is no big deal. And he doesn't quite get him to go over because Pellegrino tries to take the back. I just wanted to put that in there because I liked it. All right, so here's the point. So then he goes and takes the back. Camois does, all right? We're not going to go through the details here. Okay, that's a face of distress. He now has the back. In a jiu-jitsu tournament, the only way you could get out of this would be to peel the hands or for them to let go or something. And that's fine for jiu-jitsu. But this is MMA, where the trenches of retreat that you enjoy in these positions are no longer luxuries that you are allowed to have. This is why you want to keep this rule. It's for situations like this. And I want to show you something here. So here's what Pellegrino does. He's in obvious distress. By the way, he's a black belt himself. Okay? Here's what he does. He pulls down on the hands. He's fighting the hands. Now look at him. His posture is bent over. How far from the mat do you think he is? Not far, right? Like if I'm leaning over, maybe 3 feet, something like that, maybe less, something like that, right? About half the size of a normal man. So what's he going to do? He's just going to jump forward. He fights the hands a little bit, but you've got this monster black belt. Look, he just spikes him. Pop, just like that. Comes right off. This was perfectly legal. But I want to make a point here. Rose Namajunas got lifted in the air and dropped, okay? It kind of landed side of the head, neck. He lands almost directly on his head. We can't quite see, but pretty close. But he wasn't that high up. So which one is worse? And why would you want to regulate that out? Because look what happens in the end. Spaces gets created, and Pellegrino gets back on top. It is effective. That is exactly why you want to allow this. Because somebody who thinks that they have the comfort of a position inside normal jiu-jitsu circumstances now has it taken away. That is exactly what this rule is here to protect. The dynamic action that or the dynamic opportunities that both competitors need in order to advance their agenda, essentially, inside this contest. You remove that, you give way too much favorability to somebody who can coast inside the safety of the rule set of the composite sport from which they come from. That is not what MMA is about, and that's not what MMA should ever be about. Also, it's just kind of interesting. It's like, what's worse, to go this high or just to get spiked in short order? In any case, Pellegrino ended up taking his back and then winning the contest. Here's another one about the incoherency of the rule. Like, slam should be banned. People who might agree with me, slam should be banned, but for this circumstance. Okay, fine. I agree. But I just want you to know, as I mentioned, even that idea has a ton of holes in the boat, and we are taking on water. This is one of my favorite fights. Karo Parisian taking on Diego Sanchez. This, if you've never seen this contest, you should. And I want to show you this sequence to give you an idea of what I'm talking about here. So it's the first round. So Karo gets him here, and he goes, I think this is a Harai Goshi. I can't quite tell because I can't tell if he's on the outside of the leg or kind of in the middle here with his own leg. But just pay attention to Diego here, right? He's going to go over. They both land on their head. This is a perfectly legal technique because by the spiking rules, it was to lift somebody up and then feet to the sky and then spiking the head straight down. Well, this is more a circular motion. But nevertheless, you're crashing on top of your head. This is perfectly legal. This is why trying to ban some of this stuff, yes, you should make an effort to do and eliminate the worst of the things that could happen, the malfeasance, the bad sportsmanlike conduct, the stuff that just is truly evil with no sporting purpose. But you're going to get perfectly close, very close, with other kinds of absolutely legal, justifiable technique. And you should know that right away. It continues. By the way, here's another point. Remember the one about Cormier and Barnett, where if you slam somebody, you have to get on top of them. Part of the reason why judo is not that effective sometimes in MMA is because you can throw someone on their head and they can just kind of get right back up because you're not crashing on top of them. Look at him. He's crashing like to the side. So Diego Sanchez can simply step away and get an underhook, and they can stand. And they do. Now watch this one. This is just a few seconds later, right? Watch. They separate here. Here's 20 seconds later. Here's another one. This is the whole part about the rule set, right? Boom, boom. They're going into each other. They're fighting. They clinch. Here they go again. What do you think is going to happen? Karo's about to take him for a ride. This is your Uchimata, right? Because it's between the legs, yeah? I mean, someone who knows more from judo, maybe I'm getting the terminology wrong, but Uchimata is typically what this is. And he's going to throw him. Watch where they go. Karo lands on his head. That can't be good. But again, how far is he from the mat? Not that far. Watch Diego Sanchez. Bink, right on top, man. Right on top. Straight down. This is almost a spike, but for the fact that it doesn't quite make sense according to the rules. This is totally legal. And what happened? He got him down. And he goes to work on his guard. So this is my whole point. This is my whole point. We have limits on the worst of them, but there's only so much you can do. What are you going to do? You're going to ban Uchimatas? You're going to ban Harai Goshis? You're going to ban judo takedowns like that? Now you're just taking away MMA from MMA what it is. So we can ban the worst of it, and we should. But at some point, you begin to erode available techniques that we all value, that makes MMA special. Number two, let's look at the damage. What actually happens in terms of health outcomes year over year as a consequence of putting these rules in place? From slams, virtually nothing. And three, this is the whole point. You begin to say, well, okay, Karo's slamming people on his head, maybe, or tripping or throwing people on their head. Maybe that's not a slam, but that's just as bad. We should get rid of that too. Dude, you are taking away what makes MMA MMA. This is the whole point about this first throw, whether it was a Harai Goshi or Uchimata, this first one. Remember, in judo, right? If this was judo rules, Karo, ippon, bitches. That'd be ippon. Match over. But it's not. It's MMA. So what happens? Diego says, you can take your ippon and you can stuff it where the sun don't shine because the fight is still on. And Karo goes after him again. You cannot hide in your composite sports rules. You have to adapt it for a broader set of combat realities. If you want to take that away, you are taking away what makes MMA so special, so different, so frankly important in the combat sports space because there's no other place you can do that. There's no other place, unless you want to call it sambo, where you can throw strikes and wrestle. And even then you got the kurka, so it's not exactly the same. There's no place where you can do judo and then kick someone in the legs. There's no place where you can kick someone in the legs and then do a double leg, other than in MMA. So when I see people say that they want to take away, oh, well, we got to make sure that you're not doing dangerous things. Number one, I'm not saying it's not dangerous. It is. But I'm asking, looking here, that ain't good. But they lived, right? And more to the point, it's about what Chael Sonnen said. I give him total credit for the intellectual idea there. This is absolutely no question about the idea that what makes MMA MMA is that you take what's illegal in all the composite sports and now, all of a sudden, it is legal. We should be worried about the dangers and we should take it seriously. We should make sure we have some limits on the worst kinds of things. But when you start putting more limits on this, you're going to begin to take away the things that make MMA special. You're going to begin to take away perfectly valid techniques, and you're going to begin to interrupt something that right now does not need to be interrupted. What are the facts of the case? Is it so dangerous we have to change everything? No, it is not. And if you begin to tinker with this pretty good formula, and if you mess with the coherency of the rule set, the essence of what we're doing, you're going to ruin the whole thing. It is about maintaining all of that. Slamming out of subs is not just okay, it is pure MMA.